Matt?
Okay. So can you explain clearly, with clarity, the administration decision announcement yesterday on Egypt and the non-coup designation?
I can, but let's see. We believe that the continued provision of assistance to Egypt, consistent with our law, is important to our goal of advancing a responsible transition to democratic governance and is consistent with our national security interests. As you all know and we've all talked about, Egypt serves as a stabilizing pillar of regional peace and security, and the United States has a national security interest in a stable and successful democratic transition in Egypt. The law does not require us to make a formal determination. That is a review that we have undergone as to whether a coup took place, and it is not in our national interest to make such a determination. So we will work with Congress to determine how best to continue assistance to Egypt in a manner that encourages Egypt's interim government to quickly and responsibly transition back to a stable, democratic, civilian-led, and inclusive government.
Can you explain to me, or to all of us, how it took this crack team of lawyers 3.5 weeks to come up with a determination that essentially sounds like something that Sergeant Schultz would have said on Hogan's Heroes, or that we might all know as being the motto that is underneath pictures of 3 monkeys covering their ears, mouth, and...
I'm not a big Hogan's Heroes fan.
Yeah. Well, if you don't get the cultural reference, it's I know nothing, I see nothing. And
I understood the
monkey
reference. I just wanted to make sure that on Hogan's Heroes I wasn't going to follow that analogy.
Okay, so how exactly? It took 3.5 weeks to come up with a decision that you're going to ignore the law.
It is not ignoring the law. It was a review of what is applicable under the law, abiding by the law. We're continuing to work with Congress. This is ongoing. Obviously, our relationship with Egypt and the aid we provide and decisions over that is an ongoing process. So today is not an end. As we've talked about quite a bit in here, certainly the circumstances that have happened on the ground are very complicated, and we wanted to take the time and do due diligence to review. But there's no question that there's a larger issue of our strategic interests here and our interests as it relates to regional peace and security.
Yeah, but has this ever been done? Are you aware? Surely the building is aware, if you have ever done this before.
Well,
since the law was enacted, can you name one time that you've chosen to basically ignore it? And also, I still didn't hear the answer to the question: is why did it take 3 weeks to come up with a determination that that you are not going that you are going to apply the law in some cases and not others, and this is a case that you're not going to apply it in?
Well, I think that the American people would be appreciative of the fact that we took the time to evaluate and what is applicable under the law and take into account our important national security interests here. I'm not a historian, as we all know, and there's a lot going on here, so I certainly haven't reviewed historical references, but...
well, is there a precedent for this? Do you know?
I don't have any historical references to point you to, but we're obviously evaluating this as a specific situation.
Okay. Is your understanding of rule, that when you use the phrase rule of law, do you understand that to mean that you apply the law consistently? Like when you tell or call on another government to respect the rule of law, do you understand that to mean that you're calling on them to apply the law consistently and not selectively?
Well, when we have used rule of law, most commonly, as you know, we use it as it applies to, giving people proper charges and evaluating circumstances like
I'm talking about
arrests.
Not in terms of a criminal defendant. I'm talking about in terms of a government playing by its own rules.
Well, Matt, that is why we reviewed the law, and our legal team undertook a review, and this is an ongoing process.
But what you reviewed was the actual. You didn't review the events that happened in Egypt. You reviewed the law and decided that you didn't have to use, and came to this conclusion, which is mind-boggling, I think, that you don't have to use it.
It's not that we don't have to use it. It's we don't need to make a public declaration about whether this was a coup or not. That is what was determined.
How is it that in deciding that you don't need to make such a determination, you are not flouting the spirit of the law?
Given that our legal team was an important part of this process, certainly I would refute any notion that we were flouting the law. But it is important here.
I didn't say the law. I said the spirit of the law.
Well, I would refute that notion. Our legal team was an important part of this process. But the context of this is certainly very important here, which is our, the stabilizing pillar that is Egypt and the important role it plays in regional peace and stability.
The reason I asked about spirit as opposed to the letter is that, like you, I've read the very short portions of the law. Mm-hmm. And it does not, you're right, it does not oblige an administration to make a determination. But it does seem that the spirit of the law and the way in which it has been previously applied was that it was implicit that an administration should make a determination as to whether a military coup occurred, and that therefore it should then decide to cut off aid. So I can see how in a narrow legalistic manner you can argue that you have obeyed the letter of the law because there is no obligation to make a determination. I do not see, nor have you explained, how what you have decided is in keeping with the spirit of the law.
Well, the spirit of the law is a very theoretical question. I will say that there's also an important context we've talked about here in the millions of Egyptians who had legitimate grievances, who expressed their concern with President Morsi's non-inclusive form of governance and demanded a new, more inclusive, representative, and responsive government. So that is an important context here too. What I was trying to answer for you is the context of how this decision was made. It's not just looking at a paragraph. Certainly abiding by our legal obligations is always a priority to the United States and always something we're focused on. But there is a greater context here in terms of our national security interests, in terms of the millions of people who've expressed their grievances in Egypt.
Well, isn't abiding by your legal obligations not merely a priority, but paramount?
Of course it is, and
Okay,
we have, they've reviewed it.
Right, but what I still do not understand, and I think Matt's line of questioning is an understandable line of questioning, which is...
Certainly wasn't suggesting it wasn't. I answered the question.
But you haven't explained why this is in line with the spirit of the law, which clearly was crafted so as to require a U.S. government to cut off assistance to another country's government when its democratically elected leader was ousted in a military coup or in a coup in which the military played a decisive role. And that clearly was the spirit of the law. Why should you decide in this instance that you will not abide by what was clearly the congressional intent?
Well, first let me say that obviously we are continuing to consult with Congress and have on this specific decision as well. What I was trying to provide an answer to your question was the important context, which is applicable to the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish here, which is a stable, productive Egypt. Obviously, our national security interests are at play here. The voices of the Egyptian people are at play here. Those are all factors that go into this.
There's a reason I'm interested in this, and I'm less interested in the spirit of what you're trying to do here than I am in the letter and the spirit of the law. There are other ways that you could achieve what you're trying to achieve in Egypt. You could have gotten Congress to enact waiver authority so that you could issue a waiver. You could have gotten Congress to change the law in some other manner so as to provide an exception. You could have gotten Congress to say, well, it doesn't actually apply in the case of Egypt. But what you have instead chosen to do is to interpret the law in a manner that is, as Matt suggested, rather inconsistent with the way in which it has been applied in the past, where you have looked at the circumstances in a given country and then made a determination, and in certain cases it was a determination that a military coup had occurred, and you therefore cut off aid. Why, in this case, should you decide that what has been the spirit and historical application of the law should not apply?
Well, I think I've answered why this is a unique case, but I will also say that we, of course, recognize this is a complex situation. Our review is ongoing, as is our consultation with Congress. If there are additional steps that need to be taken to ensure that we can continue our assistance consistent with the law and in a manner that also advances U.S. national security interests, we will consider those. So it's ongoing.
Why not? I mean, you will recall that when the president took the oath of office for a second time back in 2009, the justification for his having done so was that it was out of an abundance of caution. Why would you not, out of an abundance of caution to ensure that you were in keeping not merely with the letter but also with the spirit and historical application of the law, of U.S. law, have found another solution, one that was manifestly, incontestably legal, where you got Congress to change the law, for example?
Well, we do feel this is legal. That's why our lawyers reviewed it. We did take the time, spent a couple of weeks, as you know, and as Matt also pointed out, reviewing this and evaluated, as I've mentioned, our national security interests, issues related to regional stability, as well as the importance of the voices of the Egyptian people, and this was the determination that was made. I don't have a further readout for you of those discussions.
The point is that you didn't review what happened in Egypt. You reviewed how you could, you reviewed how you could essentially abdicate the responsibility that was placed on you by this law in the first place. And I think that, as I and others have suggested since July 3rd, the question of this review was always, how are you going to be able to avoid completing it, or how are you going to be able to avoid enacting it? And I think it appears to be a very, very clumsily constructed legal cop-out to simply say that you don't have to do it. There are no exceptions in the law as it's written, like the ones that you mentioned, the broader national security interests. There's nothing in that legislation that says anything about, well, if 20 million people are in the streets protesting, then it doesn't count. You, for the first time, you meaning the government, for the first time since this law was passed, or presumably since the first time since you all stopped engineering coups on your own, and actually came out and overtly supported them, have decided that this law doesn't have to be applicable anymore. This law is not universal. It doesn't cover everything.
Matt, I think there's an important point here. So
correct?
let me just try to make this important point.
The
legal decision that was made was that we have reviewed and we do not need to make a public determination on whether or not a coup happened or not. Moving forward, we are consulting with Congress. Of course, our legal obligations are an important part of that, and believe me, from all sides. And as determinations need to be made or steps need to be taken, legislative steps, we will endeavor to take them.
So
this is an ongoing process.
What other provisions of the law are you going to just pick and choose to apply?
Matt, I think I've answered. The decision that was made, the announcement that it was.
This took 3 weeks. This is something that could have been done on day one.
We wanted to do due diligence and take the time to review here, but this is ongoing. It's not the end. This is a step in the process. Let's just do one at a time, Said. So just let Joe, and then I'll go to you next, if that works.
Do you concede that by utilising what appears to be a loophole that your lawyers have found in the law, that the reputation and the influence that the United States has in other countries is thereby tarnished? If you are going to pick and choose which situations you want to see as unique situations and therefore not applicable to the law, therefore you don't have to make a determination about whether there's a coup, a leader in any other country or a military in any other country could decide that they will go ahead with removing a legitimately elected president because there's no longer this fear that the United States will cut off military and economic aid.
Well, I'd first refute the notion this was a loophole. It was not. It was reviewed by our lawyers and determined that we did not need to make a decision or a public determination about whether or not this was a coup. The second piece I would convey is that I don't think it would come as a surprise to anyone that our own national security interests, issues related to regional stability, the voices of millions of people are all factors. Every scenario is different, but we are continuing to review. We do not anticipate that we're going to make an evaluation here. That's not what I'm suggesting related to a coup or not, but we're continuing to review our relationship as it relates to aid with Egypt, and that's ongoing. So, I would convey that to anyone who has concern.